Sometimes the hardest part of growing old isn't the aching joints or the gray hair. It's waking up one morning and realizing the life you built no longer needs you anymore. That's what happened to Margaret Maggie Sullivan one cold November morning, 62 years old, staring at the empty driveway where her youngest son's car had been parked the night before. Benjamin was on his way to Seattle now, to a promising tech job and a life she could barely imagine. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the goodbye breakfast she'd made him. Pancakes the way she'd done every first day of school since he was 5. Rusty, her 13-year-old Labrador, pressed his gray muzzle against her leg. He was moving slower these days, just like her. The arthritis in her knees served as nature's timekeeper, marking the years since Richard had walked out on their 20-year marriage for a younger colleague. 15 years of raising 3 children alone while working full shifts at Denver Children's Hospital. 30 years as a pediatric nurse, only to be regretfully let go in last month's budget cuts. Too expensive to keep, the administrator had said, not quite meeting her eyes. Younger nurses work for less. The house was too quiet now. Emily was in Boston, rising through the ranks at her law firm, too busy for more than monthly calls. Nathan in Chicago barely answered texts. And now Benjamin, her baby at 27, had finally spread his wings. Maggie sank into her father's old armchair, the one thing she'd kept after clearing out Harold Sullivan's assisted living apartment 6 months ago. The boxes of his personal effects still sat in her garage, postponed like so many tasks that required emotional energy she couldn't seem to find anymore. "What now, Rusty?" she whispered, scratching behind his ears. "What do I do with the rest of my life?" Pause for interaction. Have you ever felt like your life suddenly lost its purpose? Share in the comments where you're listening from. Rain drummed against the windows as Maggie finally gathered the courage to sort through her father's belongings. Most items were mundane: old bills, tax returns, a collection of nature magazines. But in the third box, wrapped in canvas cloth, she found his Army Bible. She recognized it from childhood. He'd kept it on his nightstand, occasionally read from it Sunday mornings. Opening it carefully, she found dried wildflowers pressed between thin pages. In the margins were 2 different handwritings, her father's blocky print and another flowing script she didn't recognize. Between Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon, she discovered a photograph. Black and white, edges scalloped in that old-fashioned way. A young woman stood before a rough wooden cabin, wearing men's work clothes, canvas pants, heavy shirt, boots. She wasn't smiling, but there was something fierce in her eyes, something uncompromising. On the back, in the flowing script, "Eleanor, summer 1926. Rusty barked sharply, pawing at the photo when Maggie laid it on the coffee table. She'd never seen him react this way to an image before. Behind the photograph was a folded paper, brittle with age, a hand-drawn map. The ink had faded to brown, but was still legible. Topographical lines marked elevation changes. A creek labeled Snowmelt Creek, and in the center, marked with an X, was a square with words above it, Home, ES. At the bottom, coordinates written in her father's handwriting, along with a single line, "When you're ready. Eleanor, ES, Eleanor Sullivan." Maggie's heartbeat quickened. Her grandmother's name had been Eleanor, her father's mother. But family lore said she died in childbirth. There were no photos of her, no stories shared, just a void where a grandmother should have been. She spent the night researching. The coordinates pointed to a remote area in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, about 6 hours from Denver. National forest land mostly, with a few private parcels grandfathered in from homesteading days. For the first time in months, Maggie couldn't sleep. Not from the usual worries about money or loneliness, but from a burning curiosity that felt strangely like hope. 3 days later, she loaded her SUV with supplies: warm clothes, sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, first aid kit, preserved food, and essentials for Rusty. She left a vague note on the kitchen counter. Taking some time for myself. Will call soon. Love, Mom. She knew it would worry her children. She didn't care. The drive took her through Colorado's plains and into the mountains, crossing into Wyoming and finally Montana. The highway climbed through pine forests already heavy with early snow. She turned onto increasingly narrow roads until finally reaching a small widening in a Forest Service road where the pavement ended. According to the map, the cabin would be about 6 miles into the wilderness from here. Maggie shouldered her heaviest backpack, secured Rusty's leash, and checked the compass on her phone. "Ready, old boy?" she asked. Rusty wagged his tail, more energetic than she'd seen him in months. The hike was brutal. November in Montana meant snow already knee-deep in places. Her body, reasonably fit for 62 but unaccustomed to mountain terrain, screamed in protest. The backpack dug into her shoulders. Her breath came in painful gasps that crystallized in the frigid air. But something kept her moving forward. Maybe it was the mystery, or perhaps something deeper, a pull she couldn't explain. Strangely, Rusty seemed to know where they were going. He strained at his leash, leading her along paths she would have missed, around treacherous slopes, almost as if he'd walked this route before. Pause for interaction. I'd love to know if you've ever followed your intuition on a journey that changed your life. Tell me in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to hear the next part of Maggie's journey. 3 hours later, just as daylight began to fade, they found it. The cabin sat in a small clearing where Snowmelt Creek bent around a rocky outcrop. It was small, built from logs that had weathered to silver gray. The roof sagged dangerously in the middle. One corner had partially collapsed, and the single window was broken. The door hung crooked on its hinges. But above the door, carved into a log and still readable after almost a century, were the words, E. Sullivan, 1926. Maggie stood motionless, breath fogging in the cold air. Rusty whined, pulling toward the door. "This is it, boy," she whispered. "This is what Dad wanted me to find." She brushed snow from the carved letters with her gloved hand. The wood was rough, the carving deep. Someone had made this with intention. A declaration, a claim. Inside, pine needles, animal droppings, and snow covered the floor. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney miraculously intact. The remains of a wooden bed frame occupied one corner. A small table had collapsed. Most of the shelves had fallen, yet somehow it still felt like shelter. Maggie worked quickly, knowing darkness fell early at this elevation. She swept out the worst debris, patched the broken window with plastic sheeting from her emergency kit, and unpacked her sleeping bag and portable stove. Most importantly, she gathered firewood and kindling, praying the chimney would draw. When flames finally leapt in the ancient fireplace, she nearly cried with relief. The cabin warmed slowly. Rusty circled the interior, sniffing intently at every corner, before settling into a strange behavior. He stood in one spot near the fireplace, barking at the floor. "What is it, boy?" Maggie knelt beside him, feeling the floorboards. One moved slightly under pressure. Using her pocket knife, she pried up the loose board. In the hollow space beneath, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound journal. Hands trembling, she opened it to the first page. The elegant script she recognized from the Bible margins filled the page. "My name is Eleanor Sullivan. I am 22 years old. Today I have claimed this cabin as my own, and I will not be moved from it. Let this record stand as testament to my choice and my freedom." Outside, the wind rose, moaning through the pines. Rusty suddenly stood alert, staring at an empty corner of the cabin, hackles raised. Maggie felt it too. A presence, a weight in the air that hadn't been there before. The temperature seemed to drop, despite the fire. "Hello," she called, her voice sounding small in the cabin's silence. No answer came, but for just a moment, she thought she heard humming, a melody so faint it might have been the wind, or might have been something more. She read until the fire burned low. The journal detailed Eleanor's flight from Seattle, from a banker twice her age whom her father had promised her to. Instead of an April wedding in 1926, Eleanor had packed her savings from her work as a school teacher and bought a train ticket east. She'd found this abandoned homesteader's cabin and decided to stay. The writing was matter-of-fact but revealed occasional moments of fear. I do not know if I can survive a winter here, but I know I cannot survive the life that was planned for me. I would rather die free in these mountains than live as property in Seattle. In May, the entries changed. A man had found her, a trapper named James. He could have reported her, forced her back to civilization. Instead, he offered to teach her. The entries through summer detailed James's lessons: how to set snares, smoke meat, identify safe mushrooms, prepare the cabin for winter. And between the practical lessons, something else emerged. Eleanor was falling in love with her teacher. In September, a single line: I am with child. James has asked me to marry him. I have refused. Maggie closed the journal, stunned. She looked around the dark cabin, seeing it now through different eyes. Her grandmother had lived here, had chosen this solitude, had carried a child, Maggie's father, within these very walls. The family story of Eleanor dying in childbirth had been a lie. That night, Maggie slept fitfully on the floor beside the dying fire, Rusty pressed against her for warmth. She dreamed of a woman with fierce eyes chopping wood in the snow, her belly swollen with child, her face set with determination. In the morning, she awoke to find small animal tracks in the dusting of snow that had blown in under the door overnight, except for one set that looked disturbingly like human footprints that ended abruptly in the middle of the floor. The morning brought clearer skies but bone-chilling cold. Maggie needed supplies, more food, proper tools, materials to repair the worst of the cabin's damage. According to her map, a small town called Pinewood lay about 12 miles away by road. The hike back to her SUV was easier in daylight, and the drive to Pinewood took less than 30 minutes. The town was tiny, one main street with a general store, gas station, post office, and diner. At Martha's General Store, Maggie loaded a cart with necessities. The older woman at the register, Martha herself, according to her name tag, made pleasant conversation until Maggie mentioned where she was staying. The old Sullivan cabin, up on Snowmelt Creek? Martha's friendly expression faltered. Nobody's lived there for decades. It belonged to my grandmother, Maggie explained. Eleanor Sullivan. The store went quiet. An elderly man setting up a display of snow shovels turned slowly. You're Eleanor Sullivan's kin? The man approached, studying her face. George Wilson. I've lived in these mountains 80 years. He paused. Eleanor Sullivan was a legend around here. Not the good kind. What do you mean? Maggie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Eleanor Sullivan came to these mountains in 1926, young woman alone, which was strange enough back then. George leaned on a snow shovel. She took over that homestead cabin and refused to leave. Had a baby up there. No husband, no doctor. Then she gave the baby away, sent it to live with family in the city. That made people talk, he continued. Women who'd been sympathetic turned against her. What kind of mother gives up her child to live alone in the woods? Stories started going around. People said she'd gone mad, that she talked to herself, walked the forest at night. Some claimed she was a witch, George's voice dropped. My grandfather told me about a woman in these mountains who lost her mind. People would see her sometimes, wandering between trees, wearing old-fashioned clothes. She'd disappear if you called out. They said she was the ghost of Eleanor Sullivan, still roaming the forest because she died alone up there, and nobody ever found her body. He paused, studying Maggie. You look like her. Got the same stubborn set to your jaw. As Maggie paid for her supplies, Martha touched her arm gently and whispered, "Don't listen to them. Eleanor wasn't crazy. She was just braver than all of us." Driving back to the trailhead, Maggie's mind raced. Her grandmother, painted as either a madwoman or a pioneer, depending on who told the story. What was the truth? Pause for interaction. Have you ever discovered something unexpected about your family history that changed how you saw yourself? I want to hear your stories in the comments. The snow began falling again as Maggie and Rusty hiked back to the cabin. By the time they arrived, dusk was settling, and the snowfall had thickened to near blizzard conditions. Inside, Maggie built a fire and spread her sleeping bag close to its warmth. Rusty seemed unusually agitated, pacing and digging at the floorboards in different spots. His behavior led Maggie to discover another loose board, and beneath it, a metal box similar to a modern safety deposit box. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, carefully preserved in wax paper. The first photos were from the 1920s, showing Eleanor at different ages, standing proudly before the cabin, kneeling by the creek washing clothes, holding a rifle. In several photos, a tall, lean man with weathered features appeared beside her. James, the trapper, Maggie assumed. In early pictures, they maintained a formal distance. In later ones, the distance closed. James with his arm around Eleanor's shoulders, the two working together on what appeared to be a new roof. Then came photos that made Maggie catch her breath. A young boy, perhaps 8 years old, standing before the cabin. The same boy at 12 holding a fishing rod, then at 15 or 16, taller and broader, with Eleanor's eyes. Her father, Harold. The photos documented his visits over years. Summers spent in these mountains with the mother who had given him away, but never truly let him go. Eleanor standing beside him, her expression complex, pride and pain mixed together. The most recent photos were from the 1980s. In one, Harold stood alone before the cabin, no longer a visitor, but a keeper of memories. The final photo showed Eleanor as an old woman, probably in her 80s, sitting on a porch rocker Maggie hadn't seen in the cabin. She looked directly at the camera with a slight smile, completely at peace. On the back in her father's handwriting, Mother, age 81, summer 1985. Maggie did the math. Eleanor had lived until at least 1985, when Maggie herself was 23, newly married to Richard, pregnant with Emily. Her grandmother had been alive all those years, and no one had told her. A surge of anger at her father rose in her chest, for the secrets kept. Then she thought of George's story, of the scandal and judgment Eleanor had faced. Perhaps Harold had been protecting his mother, honoring her choice to remain separate from the world that had condemned her. Outside, the storm intensified. Wind howled through the trees, driving snow against the cabin walls. Maggie added wood to the fire, grateful for its warmth. That's when she heard it clearly. Footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate. Not the scrabble of an animal, but measured human steps. Rusty didn't bark. Instead, he walked to the door, tail wagging slightly, as if greeting someone familiar. "Hello! Is someone there?" Maggie called, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. The footsteps stopped. Rusty whined, pawing at the door. Maggie's hand trembled as she lifted the latch and pulled the door open. The porch was empty. The clearing was empty. But in the beam of her flashlight, fresh footprints led to the door and then, impossibly, vanished. She closed the door quickly, shivering. "I'm imagining things," she muttered. But Rusty continued to stare at the door, his tail still wagging gently. That night, as temperatures plunged well below freezing, Maggie awoke to find the fire had died to embers. Cold seeped through her sleeping bag, numbing her fingers and toes. She fumbled for matches to relight the fire, but her hands were too stiff from cold. Stupid, she whispered, teeth chattering. She'd fallen asleep without properly banking the fire. In these temperatures, that could be fatal. Rusty huddled against her, shivering. Maggie pulled him closer, trying to share what little warmth remained between them. "I'm sorry, boy," she whispered. "I've dragged you into my crazy adventure." Her vision blurred. The cold was making her drowsy, a dangerous sign. She fought to stay alert, to keep moving. Then, without explanation, the fireplace erupted in flames. Maggie blinked, certain she was hallucinating, but the heat was real, warming her frozen hands and face. She hadn't touched the embers, hadn't struck a match. In the flickering firelight, she saw a figure standing beside the hearth, translucent but clearly visible. An elderly woman with wild white hair and piercing eyes, wearing men's work clothes that belonged to another century. Rusty wasn't frightened. He rose, tail wagging, and approached the apparition. "Eleanor?" Maggie whispered. The figure nodded, becoming more solid as Maggie's vision adjusted. Those eyes, she recognized them from the photographs, but also from her own mirror. They were her father's eyes. Her eyes. Eleanor didn't speak, but Maggie felt words forming in her mind, clear as if they'd been spoken aloud. "You are stronger than you know. You raised 3 children alone. You are a woman who cannot be defeated." Tears spilled down Maggie's cheeks, the first she'd cried since her father's funeral. Years of holding everything together, of never showing weakness, broke like a dam. She sobbed while the fire burned warm and steady, and the presence of a woman she'd never met, but whose blood ran in her veins, kept silent vigil. When morning came, Maggie's phone regained signal briefly as the storm cleared. She scrolled through dozens of missed calls and angry texts from her children. Emily was threatening to call the police. Nathan had actually called their father, the first time he'd spoken to Richard in years. Only Benjamin's messages showed understanding beneath the worry. While checking her emails at the town's diner, Maggie discovered a message from her father's estate attorney, one she'd missed in the chaos of the past months. The subject line, "Urgent Sullivan property tax delinquency." Her stomach dropped as she read. The cabin and surrounding land had belonged to her father, inherited from Eleanor, with conservation restrictions preventing development. Harold had faithfully paid property taxes for decades, but after his decline, 6 years of taxes remained unpaid, $47,000 in back taxes and penalties. A hearing was scheduled in 4 weeks to determine the property's fate. If no heir came forward to pay and claim the land, it would be declared abandoned and open for sale. Evergreen Resorts had already filed interest in purchasing the parcel for a luxury wilderness retreat. Maggie stared at her phone, numb. The cabin, Eleanor's sanctuary, her father's legacy, the place that had already begun to feel like home, would be lost unless she could find $47,000 in a month. Her retirement savings could cover it, barely, but that was everything she had. She called Jennifer Miller, the only attorney in Pinewood. She called her siblings, who had already signed away their claims on anything related to their father's estate. She called her children, trying to explain what she'd found and why it mattered. Emily was coldly furious. "You're throwing away your retirement for a broken-down shack. Mom, this is crazy." Nathan barely engaged. "Do whatever you want. You always have." But Benjamin surprised her. "If it matters to you, it matters. What can I do to help?" Over the next weeks, Maggie divided her time between the cabin and preparation for the hearing. She photographed everything, wrote detailed accounts of the property's history, and collected every document that might strengthen her case. Roger Hamilton, the 70-year-old grandson of James, appeared at the cabin one snowy afternoon, surprised to find someone living there. When Maggie explained who she was, his weathered face broke into a smile. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "Eleanor's granddaughter. Come home at last." Roger shared stories his grandfather had told him. How James had loved Eleanor despite her refusal to marry. How he'd respected her fierce independence. How he'd bought the surrounding land to protect her from developers and nosy townsfolk. He'd deeded it to Harold eventually, with the stipulation it remain undeveloped. My grandfather used to say Eleanor taught him the most valuable lesson of his life, Roger said, helping Maggie repair a section of roof. That love is an ownership. Most men never learn that. Roger agreed to testify about his family's connection to the property. So did Martha from the general store, who revealed her grandmother had been one of the few women who'd maintained friendship with Eleanor, despite town gossip. Even George Wilson agreed to speak about the property's historical significance. The day of the hearing arrived with fresh snow and bitter cold. The county courthouse in Pinewood was a modest brick building that also housed the county offices and sheriff's department. The three commissioners sat at a long table. Chairman Donovan, a stern-faced man in his 60s, Commissioner Clark, the only woman, perhaps 50, and a third silent member who studied papers without looking up. Representing Evergreen Resorts were Attorney Anderson, sleek in an expensive suit, and Development Director Peter Brooks, whose corporate polish seemed out of place in the small-town setting. Jennifer presented their case first: the property's history, Harold's ownership, the conservation restrictions, and the codicil showing Maggie's inheritance right. She displayed the photographs spanning decades, the journals and letters documenting continuous family connection. Anderson countered sharply, the codicil requires residency within 1 year of Harold Sullivan's death. Ms. Sullivan only arrived at the property 6 weeks ago, and before that, the property was unoccupied and untaxed for 6 years. My client is prepared to pay full back taxes, plus purchase the land at fair market value, Brooks added smoothly. They'll develop it responsibly, creating jobs and revenue for the county. Roger testified about James's relationship with Eleanor and the promises made to protect the land. Martha surprised everyone by producing a letter her grandmother had written, describing Eleanor not as a mad woman, but as a woman of remarkable courage who'd earned the private admiration of many local women. Pause for interaction. Have you ever had to fight for something that others didn't understand but meant everything to you? Share your experience in the comments below. When it was Maggie's turn to speak, she stood on shaking legs, but when she opened her mouth, her voice emerged strong and clear. Eleanor Sullivan chose freedom when the world wouldn't allow women choices, she said. My father honored her decision all his life. Now I'm choosing to begin again when society tells me I'm too old to change. She described finding the cabin, the connection she'd felt immediately, the sense of purpose that had been missing since her children grew up and her career ended. This isn't just about property rights, she concluded. It's about preserving a piece of women's history, about respecting the choices of those who came before us. Eleanor Sullivan refused to be defined by others' expectations. I'm asking you to honor that legacy. The commissioners called for a brief recess to review materials and deliberate. As Maggie waited anxiously in the hallway, the courthouse door opened, bringing a blast of cold air, and Benjamin, snowflakes melting in his dark hair. Ben, Maggie gasped. What are you doing here? He hugged her tightly. I couldn't let you face this alone. Whatever you decide, I'm with you. When the commissioners returned, Chairman Donovan cleared his throat. This is a complicated case. There's clear family connection to the property documented over decades. But there's also been a significant lapse in tax payment. Maggie held her breath. Benjamin squeezed her hand. However, Commissioner Clark spoke up, Ms. Sullivan has demonstrated current residency and clear intent to maintain the property according to its historical conservation requirements. She looked directly at Maggie. We need to protect the legacy of women who dared to live on their own terms. The vote was 2-1 in Maggie's favor. The property would remain hers, subject to payment of back taxes within 90 days. Evergreen's claim was denied. Outside the courthouse, snow fell softly as Maggie signed papers and wrote a check that nearly emptied her savings. But watching Benjamin chat animatedly with Roger about cabin repairs, she knew she'd made the right choice. This wasn't losing everything. It was investing in a new life. 3 months later, the cabin stood transformed. The roof no longer leaked. The walls were properly chinked against the cold. A wood stove Roger had helped install provided steady heat. Solar panels powered a small battery system for essentials. Emily visited first, reluctantly, then with growing interest as Maggie shared Eleanor's story. "I always thought you were weak after Dad left," she admitted one night by the fire. "But looking at you now, you were always strong. I just couldn't see it." Nathan came next, silent and awkward at first, then slowly opening up as he helped build an addition to the cabin. "So I'll have somewhere to sleep when I visit," he explained gruffly. Benjamin called weekly, planning to bring his girlfriend in spring. One evening, as winter began to loosen its grip, Rusty, slower now but still attentive, began pawing at a section of floor they hadn't explored. Beneath it, Maggie found Eleanor's final journal, written in her 80s. The last entry read, "Most people think I sacrifice love for freedom. The truth is, I found both, just on my own terms, in my own time." James returned after his wife died. "We had 20 good years together, here in this cabin. Not as husband and wife in the eyes of society, but as partners in our hearts." Harold understood. "He'll protect this place when I'm gone, and someday someone who needs this sanctuary as I did will find their way here." Spring brought the first birds back to the mountains. Rusty, who'd grown increasingly frail, passed peacefully one night beside the fire. Maggie buried him near Eleanor's grave in a small aspen grove, marking the spot with smooth river stones. "Thank you for leading me home, old friend," she whispered. Later that day, Maggie carved her own name beside Eleanor's above the cabin door. "Miss Sullivan, 2024. Sitting on the porch as evening approached, she watched the last snow melt from the meadow. For just a moment, she thought she saw two figures at the forest's edge, an elderly woman and a golden dog, transparent in the fading light. Then they were gone, vanishing between the trees. Maggie smiled, sipping her coffee. 3 generations of Sullivan women had found their way here. Eleanor choosing freedom when society forbade it. Catherine balancing between two worlds. And now Maggie, finding strength to begin again when the world said she was finished. Inside, her laptop held the first chapters of a book about them all. The wind carried a faint melody, the same lullaby she'd heard that first night, the one her father used to hum while working in his garden on Sunday afternoons. "This isn't just a story about a cabin in the woods," Maggie whispered to the empty chair beside her. "It's about finding yourself when everything else is gone. Sometimes our true sanctuary isn't a place at all, but the courage to be who we truly are, no matter what the world says." Final interaction. You're never too old to find your true self. What's your story? I'd love to hear in the comments below. Until next time, remember that the most important journey is the one that leads you home to yourself.